The tone is set, the challenge is clear, and now let's just directly jump into action.
Okay, we are privileged to have Vikram Gandhi with us today. Sorry, give me a second. Vikram Gandhi is the Gerald P. Kaminsky Senior Lecturer of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, where he focuses on courses related to sustainable finance and leadership. Back to the front. Please join us in welcoming Vikram Gandhi to the stage to share the keynote address.
I think I'm good, yeah. Great, thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction. Thank you very much to Indiaspora and Dasra for having me here. It was indeed a privilege when I got the invitation that I was lucky enough to be in Boston at this time. I traveled quite a bit. And so when I was approached, I was absolutely thrilled to do it. I've obviously known Dasra for a long period of time. I've just met Sanjeev, and we met before at a panel or something, but really look forward to, since I am part of the India diaspora as well, to get to know the organization better and see how we can collaborate. At the Harvard Business School, I've been teaching there for the last 7, 8 years, and the mission of the school is educating leaders that make a difference to the world. And I would say Neera is probably a classic example of that, a really great example of that. From an analyst at Morgan Stanley, where she could have become, I'm serious, like a very senior person, earning gazillions of dollars. She actually decided to kind of go down this route. And it's absolutely fantastic that you're celebrating your 25th year anniversary today. As I have a few multiple hats on. I mean, this is obviously the HBS hat, but I also have a venture capital fund, an advisory firm, and have been kind of investor in the Indian context for a reasonable amount of time. And I would say that while we always talk about India as an inflection point, this, that, and the other, I actually truly believe that it is the case now. And one of the stats that I always point to in that situation or that context is the fact that the GDP per capita of India is about $2,400 today. If you look at countries in the history of the last 50, 60 years, that's kind of an inflection point where the country really starts taking off. And this is something which, we're seeing the buzz, as Neera and Sanjeev talked about, seeing the buzz in India. And so as an investor, if you have a medium to long term, there'll be short-term volatility, et cetera. I'm actually very optimistic about India. And so that's one. But as a philanthropist, I have mixed feelings. And the reason I have mixed feelings is because the positive is that as the economy grows and becomes more prosperous, all boats rise. And so therefore, that will actually help a lot of the work that's being done in India. The concern is that if you actually look at the history, that when economic prosperity kicks in at scale, that the well-off get disproportionately benefited from it. And so therefore, what concerns me is that actually the path that India is on and the growth path that it's on, that will leave, it will not be inclusive unless there is true concentrated focus on making it inclusive. And I know the government talks about that, but I think the private sector, individuals like us, the global diaspora, local philanthropists in India, need to play a critical role in actually making sure that as India becomes a $5 trillion economy, third largest economy in the world, and all these other wonderful things, that we are actually focused on inclusive growth. And so this agenda that we've got today, I think actually covers that in a phenomenal way. One of the ways to think about inclusive growth is the fact that how much capital actually, and let's use the UN Sustainable Goals as a benchmark, since that now seems to be the North Star that a lot of people use, is that if you take it just purely in the Indian context, to achieve the UN Sustainable Goals, which is 2030, which is not too far away, but even if you said a little later than that, there's a deficit of about $200 billion in India to actually achieve those goals. And to put that in context, the entire spending on the social sector in India today is around $300 billion, including government spending, private spending, and everything else. So we're talking about a multiple step function of increases that are needed. The entire philanthropic pool in India today is 15 billion, 15. And so there is actually a huge gap between what needs to happen for inclusive growth in a prosperous, a potentially prosperous country like India, and the capital that's being deployed towards it. Historically, there have been a lot of funding from the World Bank and other multilateral agencies to kind of drive that. I would say that even the World Bank meetings are going on in DC right now, that India is now moving up to the upper middle income, just like I just said, growing 2,400 GDP per capita, GDP per capita. And so the multilateral spending and focus in India is going to go away. So folks like us, the private sector combined with the public sector really needs to kick in big time. So the few themes I just want to touch on today, and then I'll hope to interact with you during the course of the conference. One is, okay, so what do we do about it? So one is, philanthropy, and more of it. Whether it be through diasporas or others, but also making it more strategic. I know Dasra spends a lot of time on this in terms of how do you actually improve your return on social investment in the philanthropic context and make it a lot more strategic and directive as opposed to just writing a check. And I think what Neera and Sanjeev both said is that it's not just about money, it's about engagement, it's about bringing intellectual talent to the table and making things happen in a much more broader, scalable way. So that's one. The two things, and you all will talk a lot about it during the course of the day, so I want to spend less time just purely on the philanthropy piece. But I want to highlight two other areas which, as philanthropists and as the Indian diaspora, you may want to think about and engage in. So one is the whole area of blended finance. And what do I mean by that? I mean, I think a lot of philanthropists are starting to get into that area. But what that means is that how can, say, $1 of philanthropic capital catalyze X number of dollars of private capital? Unless we can move that, close that gap of $200 billion that is needed to address some of these societal issues, we're not going to get to where we need to get to. And the commercial capital and the private capital requires a return. And so the ability to actually, for philanthropists and the development funding organizations, to stimulate private capital in terms of blended finance. So let me give you a couple of examples. I, along with the Dell Foundation, my foundation in India, Asha Trust, have set up a company called the Blended Finance Company. I'm just showing this as an example as opposed to anything else. And what that does is actually do exactly this, which is approach philanthropists and commercial investors and bring them together and blend it. If you think about governments have been doing this for forever. I mean, if you think about debt guarantees, concessional financing, those are just ways for the government to stimulate private investment into important strategic areas. And so, for example, we've, let me talk about two areas. One is on skill development. Historically, skill development has been focused on providing the training and not downstream what happens. So there's a skill impact bond. I mean, I don't want to get into the technicalities of it, but essentially what that does is that because of philanthropic money and the stimulation that it provides, it brings in private capital, which gets paid only if, not just when the training is provided, but that training results in jobs which are stable. Because that's ultimately what really matters, and not the training itself. And so we've seen that experimenting that way, and as a result of the philanthropic piece, we got 5x of private capital coming in, because it was cushioned against any downside scenario. So, for example, and a lot of the focus is on women. And so, the historical success rate of people having a job after their training and staying in that job for 3 months or more was as low as 10 to 15%, right? This kind of bond and this experiment has kind of got it up to about 55%. And so now we're thinking about scaling it. So that's one example in the skilling area. Second example, I would say, is in climate resilience. So the Rockefeller Foundation has been doing some work in India on this, but I think there's a lot more to do. And an example of that would be that climate change, whether it be excessive rainfall or heat zones, disproportionately affect the poor by far, and has disproportionate, pretty severe effects potentially on health. And so one of the things is that as climate change kind of kicks in, and you have these excess rainfall events and heat zone events, like how do you make sure that people get the money to actually deal with the healthcare issues? So historically, you've had insurance products which deal with that, But getting that out into the rural areas, especially if they're not very tech-enabled, is extremely hard. So the thing that we're experimenting with is to have the payments made to certain incomes of the population when there is a climate trigger event, as opposed to somebody falling sick and making a claim. So if you go beyond a certain amount of rainfall or beyond a certain amount of heat zone, that payment to that person kicks in. And now the insurance industry will not do it on its own because you don't know what the commercial outcome is, you're a publicly traded company or whatever. But we're working with some foundations to actually provide the mechanism to put that in place, provide some first loss guarantees on that, so that the insurance industry can kick in and do this at scale. So and there are a lot of other examples like this. So I just leave the concept of blended finance beyond, pure philanthropy, which I think is absolutely critical. But this is another form of philanthropy. This is about catalyzing private capital at scale to make things happen. The second piece I would really quickly touch on is on the broad areas of impact investing. Again, it's basically investing with the intention of making a difference or an intervention on something that's important to you, but having an objective of commercial returns, or returns, maybe not fully commercial, but returns. And there too, I think the role that philanthropists can play is critical. So let me give you an example of that. So about 7 years ago, so Pramod Dasin, who's my partner in this Asha Ventures, we had set up, we were investing in some affordable housing companies, and what we found was an affordable housing company, for those who may not be familiar, in India, is roughly an apartment that costs $10,000, 500 square foot, 2 bedrooms. All right, that's affordable housing. It's not something that costs $100,000 or $50,000. It's $10,000, 2 bedroom, 500 square foot. So what we invested in those because the supply is limited, but what we found is that even the demand is limited, in the sense that a person who actually wants to buy that kind of home is typically earning $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year, and actually doesn't have the capital to buy it. So and there's no access to financing for that population, at least there wasn't at that time, right? The banks don't touch it, the NBFCs don't touch it, and so they don't have any financial data. Right? And so therefore, there was this huge gap that even if you created this massive supply of affordable housing, you actually had the demand problem where there were no buyers or not enough buyers. So we said, well, why shouldn't there be a mortgage company that focuses on this segment of the population? And so we scratched NBFC using technology, and I know we have some panels on technology, which I think is absolutely critical, using technology and algorithms to underwrite purchases of $10,000 homes with a mortgage of $6,000, underwritten purely based on societal kind of information as opposed to any financial information. And that, we didn't know where that was going to go. We didn't know how it was going to evolve. But essentially what has happened is that the growth has been phenomenal. I mean, the demand, obviously, the underlying demand is massive. The default rates have been really low. We also have, obviously, the financial security of the home itself, but it's unlikely you'd ever take over a home of a affordable housing home. So you really got to underwrite in such a way that that eventuality doesn't actually happen. So the default rates have been extremely low because when someone is given the access to a home, I think they would take that really, that's really important. And now we've just moved on from being a philanthropic kind of endeavor, if you will, to a full commercial endeavor. That company is valued today at $1 billion, and we have private equity people all in there. And the only reason I bring that up is not like this was some big investment home run, but this was started with a pure philanthropic intent. And the gain that has been made is going to be plowed back into the next phase of philanthropy. It's not going into anyone's pocket. So I just wanted to highlight to you that there's a whole spectrum of ways that both money and intellectual power can make a difference. We teach this at the HBS. The course I'm teaching right now is on sustainable investing. And we talk about the whole spectrum of philanthropy. If you look at the spectrum of financial returns and social returns, you have philanthropy on one hand, which is high social returns, no financial return. You have commercial on the other hand, high financial return, no social return. And there's a huge spectrum in the middle. which you can, depending on how you approach these things, can take advantage of. So I just wanted to leave a few thoughts with you along those lines to think kind of a little bit outside the box, do more in philanthropy, make it more strategic. I think India is at a cusp of its growth, but as I said right at the start, that I'm also concerned about the fact that history has suggested that when economies really take off, unless there is intentionality, a large chunk of the population gets left behind. And we, as diaspora members, as other philanthropists who may be interested in India, should not let that happen. I'm very excited to see the overall agenda of the conference. I look forward to kind of spending time with you during the course of the day. I mean, I think the topics that are covered are fantastic in terms of innovation and growth and how we're positioned in 2047, gender equity, climate resilience, skill development, using tech, social innovation. I mean, all the topics are fantastic, and the ability to bring all that together in a comprehensive package is great. Hopefully, at the end of the day, there's a call to action. We have the Indian Philanthropy Forum. I guess you're going to have these all over the world now. So the call to action that this is not just about talking and kind of pontificating, it's actually about doing. And so with that, thank you very much again for having me. I really appreciate it.